Good afternoon. Our presentation today is titled Rana Plaza, a wake-up call to global clothing brands. This case focuses on the 2013 collapse of a garment factory in Bangladesh, one of the deadliest industrial disasters in history. It raises serious questions about corporate accountability, ethical sourcing, and the treatment of workers in global supply chains. Before I begin, I'd like you to think about the clothes you're wearing. Where were they made? Who made them, and under what conditions? Imagine a busy garment factory, hundreds of sewing machines humming, workers on tight deadlines, and pressure from international buyers to meet low-cost quotas. This was a daily reality for thousands of people in Rana Plaza until one day that reality turned into a nightmare. This case is not just about a building collapsing, it's about the failure of an entire system. It's about global supply chains that value speed and low cost over safety and dignity. And it is about the ripple effects of our choices as consumers and the responsibilities of the companies we buy from. Before we delve into this case, here is an overview of what the presentation is going to cover. I, Maddison, will start by outlining the background and key facts of the Rana Plaza collapse. This will provide the foundation for the rest of our discussion. Following this, Tali will introduce the key management theories that help us understand the case, including corporate social responsibility, stakeholder theory, and business ethics. These are the tools which help us evaluate whether companies are meeting their ethical obligations. Then, Oscar will explore the different stakeholders involved, their roles, and the underlying causes of the disaster. Who had power, who didn't, and how these power imbalances contributed to the disaster. Finally, Liam will discuss the key lessons learned and provide recommendations for how global clothing companies can prevent such tragedies in the future. We will conclude by summarizing the key points from our presentation. Each of us will speak for around 7 to 8 minutes each, and together we will present a full analysis of this important case. We chose this structure for a reason. Each section builds on the previous one to form a complete picture. Not just what went wrong, but why it matters globally. From understanding the facts to applying management theories, and from stakeholder accountability to real-world recommendations. Our aim is to uncover what organizations can and must learn from Rana Plaza. I will begin with a summary of the case. On the 24th of April 2013 at 9 a.m., one of the deadliest industrial disasters in history occurred in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The collapse of the Rana Plaza building. Over 3,500 workers, mostly young women, some teenagers, and even small children who were on on-site nursing facilities, were inside the building at the time of the incident. They were producing clothes for well-known fashion brands including Walmart, Benetton, and Primark. The day before the incident, both workers and managers noticed visible cracks in the building. A government inspector even ordered for there to be an evacuation. However, the next morning, factory bosses told employees they must return to work or they would risk losing their wages for the next month. Many of them had no choice. Less than 1 hour into their shift, the entire building collapsed. Within seconds, 8 floors came crumbling down on top of one another, crushing thousands of people. 1,129 people died and more than 2,500 people were injured, many now suffering life-altering conditions like amputations or spinal damage. Some survivors, like Paki Begum, were trapped for over 36 hours and eventually had to have their legs amputated on site with a hacksaw and without proper anesthetic. Another woman was rescued 17 days later, miraculously still alive under the rubble. Investigations of the incident revealed a long list of failures. For one, the building was illegally expanded. It was not designed for industrial use and was only approved through corruption and bribes. On top of that, there was no enforcement of safety standards. These factors, combined with the exploitative pressure of global supply chains, created a perfect storm. The garment industry in Bangladesh employs over 3 million people. Many work for just 14 to 26 cents per hour. They often work for 13 to 14 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. They cannot afford to say no to unsafe working conditions. This case matters because it shows how low-cost manufacturing comes at a high human cost. What makes this case especially disturbing is the speed with which some companies distance themselves. Major brands were quick to deny responsibility, claiming they didn't directly own the factories, but they were sourcing for them. It exposed a lack of corporate accountability, oversight, and a broken system of subcontracting where no one takes responsibility for worker safety. While the collapse did lead to the formation of the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety, many survivors waited months or years for compensation. Ultimately, Rana Plaza was more than just a tragic accident. It was a wake-up call, one that challenged the global fashion industry to reconsider what it means to ethically source goods in a globalized economy. So I want you to ask yourself, what is the real price we pay for a $5 t-shirt? Now that we have explored what happened, why it happened, and why it matters, Tali will talk you through the theoretical relevance of the case.
Thank you, Maddison. Hi, I'm Tali, and as Maddison mentioned, I'll be discussing the theories relevant to the case with a focus on stakeholder theory, business ethics, and corporate social responsibility. So, stakeholder theory originates from arguments made by Freeman in 1984. It looks at the interconnected relationships between organizations and stakeholders and how they affect each other, and argues that organizations should look at more than just shareholders' interests and instead place importance on creating value for all stakeholders. So, stakeholder theory looks at ethical obligations around stakeholder engagement, as well as the strategic benefits of a stakeholder engagement. And it can be used as a tool to better understand and describe the business world and promote better action. It does this by helping identify and address stakeholder concerns, building information and value systems to manage stakeholders, guiding decisions to balance different stakeholder interests based on an understanding of situational behaviours, and predicting and measuring outcomes of company behaviour. Stakeholder theory can also be used in strategic management to increase financial performance, as one of the main variables in strategic management is economic performance, which can be affected by changes in stakeholder returns or returns on assets. So now we'll be looking at business ethics, and it has been argued that stakeholder theory can be used as a strategic management method by promoting ethical principles, as the effort to meet stakeholder needs also has the aim of improving society. Ethics are the principles that determine right or wrong conduct and behaviour. Business ethics are principally normative. Normative stakeholder theory approach focuses on normative and moral commitments with stakeholders and sees stakeholders as having value outside of benefiting the organisation. The normative approach places emphasis on the organisation's ethical obligations and how they can be fulfilled without compromising economic success. There are many factors that influence how people react when facing an ethical dilemma. This includes the stage of their moral development, characteristics of their personality, their ethical principles, the intensity of the issue, the organization's structure, and the organization's culture. So the final part of the theory that I'll be discussing is corporate social responsibility, otherwise known as CSR. And as discussed, stakeholder theory shifts the focus from only shareholders to include creating value for broader stakeholder groups, such as employees and communities. One model that applies stakeholder theory to create greater value for stakeholders is CSR. There is no agreed upon definition of CSR or what it includes. However, some have described it as a business model whereby businesses focus on social, environmental, and ethical issues and aim to positively impact these areas while minimizing the negative effects of the business on the related areas. Archie Carroll suggested that there are 4 basic components of CSR that form a pyramid. This pyramid is shown on the right-hand side of this slide. So the foundational base of the pyramid is economic responsibilities. Fundamentally, businesses are normally motivated by profit and economic returns. Therefore, the other components of the CSR pyramid are built on the foundation of economic responsibilities. So the next layer of the pyramid is legal responsibilities. This is the second component of the pyramid, as all businesses are expected to comply with legal requirements. And these legal responsibilities often provide a basic framework for ethical conduct. And that brings us to the third layer of the pyramid, which is ethical responsibilities. Ethical responsibilities are standards expected by society, although not lawfully required. They encompass what people consider fair, just, or right practices. Philanthropic responsibilities are at the top of Carroll's pyramid, as they go beyond the laws and standards that are required or expected to be complied with, and instead meet the expectation of being a good corporate citizen. So philanthropy is desired by the community, but it's often not a compulsory practice, as businesses are not seen as unethical if they do not reach the desired level of contribution. So the CSR pyramid that Carroll suggested was one of the first attempts to provide a framework for understanding the different components of CSR and how they influence management decisions. More recently, some scholars have argued that environmental performance, societal objectives, and sustainability objectives should also be represented in CSR definitions as well. But there are also two dimensions of CSR, the internal dimension and the external dimension. So the internal dimension focuses on meeting the needs of internal stakeholders through things like knowledge building activities such as training and education, and looking after staff health and well-being. It also includes work health and safety and promoting staff advancement and equal opportunities. The more frequently discussed dimension of CSR is the external dimension, and that's more concerned with external stakeholders and the external environment. So now that we've gone over the theories, I'll be discussing how those discussed theories are relevant to this case. And so the Rana Plaza incident showcased devastatingly poor stakeholder management, and it was across multiple areas. There was an overwhelming absence of business ethics and socially responsible behaviour. The employees of the garment factory companies that were working in the building were internal stakeholders of the companies they worked for. So these companies clearly had not placed any importance on creating value for their employees and instead prioritized economic success over fulfilling ethical obligations. And it seems they had no regard for their ethical obligations to their employees and continuously showed a lack of care and disregard to their safety and well-being, and it was at an extreme level. So the Rana Plaza incident fatally displays the necessity of effectively managing internal CSR to meet the needs of internal stakeholders, which in this case were the employees. And it stresses the importance of ethically prioritizing work health and safety. Additionally, the neglect of internal CSR management was so extreme that it affected the external dimensions of CSR. So external stakeholders such as the government, the regulators, the building inspectors, and other stakeholders would have likely been negatively impacted by the incident and the press surrounding it. So the next theory we'll be talking about is Carroll's CSR pyramid. And so it's clear that they did not consider any of the foundations of CSR beyond the economic foundation, but it wasn't in a responsible way. So the second block of the pyramid is legal responsibilities, which the company plainly ignored. First, when operating in a building that did not have the required plans for the machinery, and then when outright defying the building inspector's orders to evacuate the building. So it's kind of indisputable that the companies also did not consider the next building blocks of ethical responsibilities, which would require the company to do what is right and avoid harm, and philanthropic responsibilities, which include improving the quality of life by being a good corporate citizen. So overall, they only really looked at the ethical foundation of CSR, but not in a responsible way. And so the next one we'll be talking about is the ethical behaviour, and it's kind of apparent that the companies operating in Rana Plaza did not have sufficient methods in place to determine how to deal with an ethical dilemma. A lack of moral development was displayed when choosing to behave in a way that best served the authority figure's self-interests, in this case, the supervisors. Additionally, there was an obvious miscalculation of the issue intensity and the amount of harm and the likelihood of the harm caused by a lack of internal CSR and ethical behavior management. And finally, the organization's structure and culture almost certainly played a part in the unethical behavior exhibited when facing the dilemma. For example, the companies displayed a mentality focused on making profit no matter the consequences, which is likely formed from poor management decisions and performance, as well as unethical incentives for increasing profit. And so now that we've discussed the theoretical relevance of the case, Oscar will go over the stakeholder analysis and root causes.
Thank you, Tali. I would now like to discuss the stakeholders involved, their conflicting interests, and finally, the underlying problems that truly caused the Rana Plaza disaster. First, to understand the disaster, we have to understand the stakeholders involved. In this instance, there were 5 key stakeholders involved. Stakeholder theory suggests that organizations exist in a web of relationships. If stakeholder interests are ignored or unbalanced, it can be detrimental to these organizations. The first stakeholders we have are the workers. At the time of the collapse, there were over 3,500 workers inside the building, mostly young women. Their interest was simple. They wanted safe working conditions, fair pay, and the ability to support their families. Unfortunately, they had no power at all. The day before the collapse, visible cracks were seen inside the building and was ordered to be evacuated. But the day of, workers were forced back into the building. Factory owners and managers said if they didn't return, they would lose a month's wage. So they had to return, fearing for their safety. The next stakeholders we have were the factory owners and the managers. Their concern was with maintaining contracts with multinational buyers. But even these guys operated on slim margins. Multinational buyers forced low costs, fast production, and maximum output onto these guys. Factory owners and managers wanted 2 things. They wanted to survive in a competitive market and to profit. All these things combined led to cut costs on safety, pushing excessive hours onto workers, and finally, ignoring visible cracks inside the building. Factory owners and managers did one thing, prioritizing profit over safety. The next stakeholders we have were the global brands and retailers, for example Walmart, Primark, and Benetton. Their interests were cheap supply chains to maximize profit and low consumer prices. But, unfortunately, after the collapse, while some paid settlements, others denied accountability or concealed their payouts. The main thing that these global brands and retailers had were they had the ability to distance themselves after the collapse. Alongside this, their purchasing power and short deadlines pressured owners to cut corners. Next, we have Bangladeshi governments and regulators. These guys had a dual role. On the one hand, they wanted to enforce safety laws, for example, safe working conditions, or not excessive hours. But on the other hand, they wanted to protect the garment industry, which was 80% of exports, worth $20 billion in this market. These guys had the incentive to ignore violations to protect the economy. A great example of this is when the building construction happened, there was only supposed to be 6 floors, but there was an extra 2 illegal floors added. The weak enforcement left workers vulnerable, with no power and no say. Finally, we have the NGOs and unions. Groups like Clean Clothes Campaign and Human Rights Watch are some great examples. Their interest was simple. They wanted workers' rights, safety, accountability, and compensation. But again, these guys were at the bottom of the hierarchy. They had no power and limited influence, and they were ignored by the more powerful stakeholders. In summary, Workers wanted safety, owners wanted survival and profit, brands wanted low costs and fast supply, governments wanted economic growth, NGOs wanted accountability and rights. The outcome we saw: the weakest stakeholders, the workers, bore all the risk and ended up in tragedy. Now I'd like to discuss the conflicting interests that played out in Rana Plaza. Rana Plaza is a great example of how conflicting interests can play out in practice. The core theme: profit versus safety. On the left side, we have profit. Factory owners and managers were driven by minimizing costs and maximizing output. They wanted to survive in a competitive market and to profit. In doing so, they cut corners on safety, forced workers to work long hours, and generally ignored safety concerns. We also had the brands. They demanded low prices and maximum output. They pushed factory owners and managers into cutting corners because all they wanted was profit. They wanted to have a cheap supply chain instead of an ethical one. They chose cheapness and speed. Finally, we have the governments and regulators. Their conflict was mainly between worker safety or economic growth and prosperity, and quite clearly they chose the economic growth, ignoring safety concerns or just not enforcing anything. It's quite clear which side they were on. On the other side, we had safety. The first and most obvious was the workers. Not only did they want a fair pay and the ability to support their families, but they really wanted safe working conditions. When they didn't want to return to work on the day of the collapse, but were forced back to, that's a great example of how these guys conflicted interests. Finally, we had the NGOs and unions. The NGOs and unions were also on the workers' sides. They advocated for their safety, the accountability of global brands and retailers, and finally compensation. Unfortunately, both the workers and NGOs and unions didn't have enough power to truly advocate for their safety, and Rana Plaza ended up happening. In conclusion, Rana Plaza showed what happens when conflicts remain unsolved. Profit outweighed safety, disaster became inevitable. Finally, I would like to discuss the systematic problems behind Rana Plaza. Rana Plaza wasn't just some freak accident that happened. There were many problems under the scenes that truly caused this accident. The first was corruption. As I stated previously, 6 floors were allowed for construction originally, but 2 extra illegal floors were added. Alongside this, bribes and political connections bypassed regulations. This created a system where rules could be ignored if convenient. Safety didn't matter. The main concern was profit. Next was the weak oversight and enforcement. This came from the side of the governments and the regulators. Inspectors ordered the evacuation the day before the collapse, but the day of, the orders were ignored. Factories reopened without consequence until, of course, after the disaster. Laws only existed on paper. There was no real enforcement. Safety didn't matter. Next, we had the supply chain opacity. Brands outsourced through multiple subcontractors. This allowed them to deny direct responsibility. While some brands did come forward, did pay out, many others denied direct responsibility. And they could do this because of the supply chain opacity. Finally, and maybe the most crucial one, was the power imbalance. The workers were at the bottom of the hierarchy. They had no power, no union protection. They couldn't say no. The morning of, they were forced into unsafe work, and forced with a month's wage loss. Next, we had the factory owners. These guys were in the middle of the hierarchy. Of course, they did force the workers back to work, but they themselves were squeezed by global brands and retailers for low costs and fast production, which did force them into doing the other stuff. We also had the global brands, of course. These guys had the most power. They set prices, deadlines, shaped the entire supply chain, and shifted the risk downwards, without having any risk on their side. The government prioritized economic growth over worker safety, and they were also around the middle of the hierarchy. Finally, we had the NGOs and unions. Unfortunately, these guys were also on the bottom of the hierarchy. They advocated for workers, but lacked any real influence. In conclusion, Rana Plaza was not some freak accident. It was rooted in systemic issues such as corruption, weak enforcement, supply chain opacity, and power imbalance. Now, I would like to pass this on to Liam.
Now that we have examined what happened, explored stakeholder theory, identified the main stakeholders, and analyzed the root causes, I would like to go one step further and examine important lessons that can be learned from this case, including what long-term changes are needed, the consumer's role in holding businesses accountable for their ethics, and the demand for more responsible supply chains. Building on the CSR and business ethic theory from earlier, it becomes clear that many brands have adopted a rather defensive CSR strategy, meaning that they only react when they feel pressured, making accidents like the Rana Plaza not an isolated incident. The lesson that can be learned here is that they should have implemented a proactive CSR right from the beginning, with one of the main focuses being worker safety. This includes taking measures beforehand to minimize the likelihood of accidents like this happening in the first place. In addition to that, the companies involved should have been more transparent both before and after the accident. On the one hand, security checks that have revealed clear warning signs by local inspectors were ignored. Third-party inspections by brands like Walmart and Benetton had not even started when the building collapsed, and afterwards there were no audits or reviews made available, indicating that the brands were dishonest with the public. This transparency gap is in need of significant improvements in order to create a lasting change. On the other hand, those brands did not take full accountability either, and some companies even distanced themselves from what happened. This emphasizes the need for ethical responsibility and fashion brands actively monitoring and improving labor conditions and not looking away. Lastly, another main lesson that can be learned lies in the mishandling of the compensation process. While some of the families involved received only little compensation, others have not received any payments after multiple years of waiting. This cannot be overlooked and seen as acceptable in a market that is driven by low-cost labor. In fact, worker safety should be a top priority. Based on all these aspects that should have been done differently, we can see that there is an urgent need for a systemic reform and fundamental restructuring. In the following, I will examine and explain the most crucial long-term changes needed to rebuild trust and work towards a more ethical fashion industry. First of all, there should be external audits and third-party assessments conducted regularly and in great detail to ensure all regulations and standards are met. While some of the brands have made public that measures like these are already planned, it is of utmost importance to make sure that they are actually carried out continuously and that they are thoroughly monitored and controlled. In addition to that, it would be advisable to have policies mandated by law to move from voluntary agreements to mandatory contracts. When the collapse happened, the laws that existed at the time were poorly enforced, leading to the failure to act on specific warnings, which was reinforced by corruption that prioritized low costs. As mentioned previously, it is also crucial to make supply chains operations more transparent. In the long run, this is the only way to ensure that brands really keep their word and put the proposed measures into practice. Furthermore, fundamental restructuring must come along with strengthening the workers' voices. This change is important as workers are on the front line of production, placing significant weight on their concerns and thoughts. Additionally, this enhances the compliance of ethical standards. Fashion brands, but also other companies, should start viewing safety as a core value, not a cost. This includes dropping the cost-cutting mentality that is still widely prevalent across the entire fashion industry and prioritizing safety and ethics. Regarding the role of consumers, they play an important part in shaping the system. In a way, consumers are also stakeholders, as their decisions and spending habits significantly influence industry practices. This is because brands base their production practices on what consumers approve and disapprove. If most consumers were to take the decision to reward companies for acting ethically, this would incentivize and encourage them to shift towards a proactive CSR. Consumers should, for example, demand transparency and choose to buy from brands that have fair labor certifications. This approach has already been approved in some cases, like for example through the brand Patagonia, which prioritizes ethical production. On top of that, boycotts of popular brands like H&M or Zara, for example, have shown to be successful and to initiate a shift in corporate behavior. Especially when a brand is afraid of damaging its reputation, pressure from the outside can have a great impact. However, in order to achieve this pressure and make more people aware of safety standards in outsourced factories, there's a critical need to educate. This could be done by breaking down and explaining what exactly happens when consumers make a purchase from certain brands to make them aware of the impact of their purchases. In this regard, support stakeholder initiatives could emphasize how collaborative efforts between them can have a positive impact on labor conditions and supply chain practices. To come to a conclusion, Rana Plaza was not just an accident. It was the result of failures in institutional governance, business ethics, and public awareness. Many flaws came together, ranging from ignored warnings to operations in non-compliance, as well as putting cost over safety. To avoid incidents like this in the future, many important changes are required. In the long run, the main focus should be on creating safe environments that are well monitored, that give workers and NGOs a stronger and more powerful voice, and that are enforced consistently. Additionally, global fashion brands must significantly improve their accountability and make a shift from a defensive CSR to a proactive CSR that forces them to act before something like the Rana Plaza incident happens again. Strengthening and enhancing consumer awareness and education, especially when it comes to the current production processes and safety standards in outsourced factories, is one step in the right direction that might have a great impact on future developments. Ultimately, ethics must be considered at every stage of a company's supply chain. There is no room for cost savings when human lives are at stake. In the end, Rana Plaza was a historical event that serves as a valuable lesson for the future. It is not only up to the government and the companies to make a difference, but also up to us as consumers, as we have a great influence on production processes through our purchasing decisions. This concludes our presentation on the Rana Plaza tragedy and ethical failures in the global fashion industry. Thank you for your attention and for taking your time to review this project. If you have any questions regarding any of the points mentioned, please feel free to reach out and engage with us further. We have also attached a list of all references and sources for your review.